On June 20th, 1756, after months of rising tension between the British East India Company and the rulers of Bengal, India, the company's fortified headquarters at Fort William was besieged by thousands of soldiers. When the fighting ended and the British defenders were overwhelmed, more than 100 prisoners were taken captive. With nowhere else to hold these men, the captives were forced into a small basement cell inside the fort. What would go on to happen inside that room would become one of the most infamous and disturbing stories in colonial history. It would be so horrifying that it would become known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the middle of the 18th century, India was a place where the old order was slowly beginning to loosen its grip. For generations, the Mughal Empire had ruled over vast stretches of the country, with its authority extending across cities, farmland, and major trade routes. The emperor in Delhi still carried immense power, but by the 1700s, the empire's reign had begun to weaken. In many provinces, control had shifted into the hands of regional rulers known as nawabs. These men technically governed on behalf of the emperor, but in practice, they ruled with considerable autonomy. One of the richest and most important of these provinces was Bengal. Located in the fertile delta where the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers meet the ocean, the region had long been a center of agriculture and trade. As you might imagine, this wealth naturally attracted foreign merchants. European traders had been arriving for more than a century, with the Portuguese first, followed by the Dutch and then the French. The British then joined later through the East India Company. Like its rivals, the company operated coastal trading posts where agents bought and sold goods. But while officially commercial enterprises, these companies often maintained fortified settlements, hired soldiers, and negotiated directly with local rulers. Then as their influence grew, they began acting less like merchants and more like political powers operating inside someone else's territory. In the 1690s, company agents founded a settlement along the Hooghly River that eventually grew into the city of Calcutta. What began as a modest outpost expanded into a busy commercial center of warehouses, docks, and markets serving both European and Indian merchants. To protect this settlement and its valuable goods, the British constructed Fort William near the river, which became the military and administrative heart of the company operations in Bengal. And for years, the British presence struck a fragile balance. The company controlled only a small area around its settlement and depended heavily on good relations with the nawab who ruled the province. As long as those ties held, commerce flourished and both sides benefited. But by the mid-18th century, that balance was straining. European competition intensified and local rulers grew wary of the expanding power of foreign companies within their borders. When Siraj-ud-Daulah became the Nawab of Bengal in April of 1756 at just 23 years old, he inherited one of India's wealthiest provinces and one of its most politically complicated. Rising to power after his grandfather's death, he faced rival factions within his own court and mounting external pressures, and many doubted his ability to rule. In that environment, maintaining authority required decisiveness, and the presence of powerful foreign trading companies operating inside his territory was a problem he couldn't ignore. And of all the Europeans in Bengal, the British East India Company concerned him the most. The company had built a profitable commercial network, but its behavior increasingly tested the limits. One of the central issues involved trade privileges granted under early rulers that allowed British merchants to avoid many customs duties. In theory, the exemptions applied only to company goods, but in practice, they were widely extended to private traders, allowing large volumes of merchandise to move through Bengal untaxed. The situation then only worsened when the company began strengthening the defenses of Fort William without his permission. British officials claimed the upgrades were meant to guard against a possible French attack, but to Siraj, a foreign company was expanding a military stronghold inside his province without consultation. It suggested the British believed they could act independently of his authority. He then ordered construction to stop immediately, but company officials ignored the command and continued their work. For Siraj, the defiance was intolerable, so faced with what he saw as a direct challenge to his rule, he decided to take action. In June of 1756, Siraj began assembling a large army to deal with the problem directly. Contemporary accounts describe a force numbering around 50,000 soldiers supported by artillery and accompanied by hundreds of elephants that carried supplies and equipment. Once assembled, the army began moving south toward Calcutta. On June 16th, Siraj's forces reached the outskirts of the British settlement, and as they advanced through the surrounding areas, they quickly overwhelmed the limited resistance they encountered. The approach of such a large army also sent shockwaves through the European community in Calcutta, and inside Fort William, the British suddenly found themselves facing a crisis they had not expected. As Siraj's army moved closer to Calcutta, fear and confusion began spreading through the British settlement. The news that a massive force was approaching left many residents uncertain about what to do. Fort William had been built to offer protection, but few people had expected it to be tested by an army of that size. So rather than preparing for a prolonged defense, many of the British officials chose to flee instead. The governor of Calcutta and several senior officials fled toward the ships anchored in the harbor along the river. Their departure, though, left the city in chaos. Women and children were hurried towards the waterfront in hopes of reaching the safety of the ships, while merchants and residents scrambled to save what property they could. Then those who were unable to escape took shelter inside Fort William, believing its walls would offer at least some protection. The unit that remained behind to defend the fort, though, was small and poorly organized. In total, the defenders numbered only a few hundred men. Among them were roughly 170 to 180 English soldiers, along with a mixture of European volunteers and militia. And although the number of defenders varies slightly depending on the source, one thing was clear: they were badly outnumbered. Against Siraj's army that numbered in the tens of thousands, the small force inside Fort William stood little chance of holding out for long. And the situation was even more difficult because the British had lost much of their leadership when the governor fled. In the absence of a clear commander, those who remained at the fort had to decide quickly who would take charge of the defense. The man they ultimately turned to was John Zephaniah Holwell. Earlier in his life, he had served as a military surgeon, but by 1756, he was just a senior administrator within the East India Company. Faced with an approaching army and few alternatives, he agreed, and once he took command, it quickly became clear that the defenders of Fort William were in a precarious position. On top of everything else, many of the fort's weapons and supplies had been neglected for years. Some of the gunpowder stored in the fort had become damp and could not be used. Ammunition stocks were also unreliable, and in some cases, the ammunition intended for the fort's cannons had deteriorated badly while sitting in storage. The fortifications themselves were also far from ideal. Portions of the defenses had been hastily reinforced in recent months, but the work had not been completed. To make matters worse, some of the Indian soldiers who had been serving with the British forces deserted as Siraj's army approached. John and the remaining soldiers did what they could to prepare for the attack, but the odds were heavily stacked against them. The approaching army was far larger, better supplied, and determined to bring the British settlement under Siraj's control. Over the next several days, the Nawab's forces continued to press in around Calcutta. Outside the walls of Fort William, Siraj's army continued to close in, and as it did, it brought artillery fire onto the fort. By Sunday, June 20th, the situation had reached the inevitable breaking point. Inside the fort, John was faced with an impossible decision. Continuing the fight would almost certainly result in the building's complete destruction. He understood that if the battle continued much longer, many of the men under his command would be killed unnecessarily. So faced with those circumstances, he chose to seek an agreement with Siraj rather than allow the effort of the troops to end in a bloodbath. Sometime during the afternoon of June 20th, John raised the white flag to signal a surrender. The fighting then came to an end soon afterward, and the surviving British soldiers, along with company officials and other residents, were rounded up by the Nawab's troops. The prisoners were then disarmed and placed under guard as Siraj's forces secured control of the settlement. For many of those who had surrendered, the expectation was that they would be held temporarily while arrangements were made for their custody, because prisoners of war were not uncommon in conflicts of the period. As evening approached and the captives were gathered inside Fort William, however, the Nawab's guards began searching for a place to hold them for the night. In doing so, they chose a small room within the fort that had been built years earlier for a different purpose. This room would soon become known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Inside Fort William, there were several small holding cells used to detain minor offenders like drunken sailors, disorderly soldiers, or anyone who caused trouble within the settlement. One of these cells was a small room located within the fort's guardhouse. It measured roughly 14 feet by 18 feet, or 4.3 meters by 5.5 meters, a space large enough to comfortably hold a handful of people. Under normal circumstances, it might have been used to confine 2 or 3 prisoners at a time, but it was never intended to house a large group. The room had only 2 small windows on one side, both fitted with thick iron bars, and ventilation inside was limited. The windows also opened toward a narrow veranda outside the building, which blocked much of the air that might have otherwise circulated throughout the cell. The iron bars themselves further restricted the flow of fresh air, making for a stuffy environment even when no one was being held within the room. On most nights, this would have been uncomfortable but manageable for the few individuals normally confined there. On the night of June 20th, however, conditions inside the fort were far from ordinary. Calcutta in June that year was brutally hot. The monsoon rains that usually brought some relief from the heat had not arrived yet, and the air was thick with humidity. The weather that evening was particularly oppressive, as temperatures were said to have reached around 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 Celsius outside. Adding to the misery were fires burning in various parts of the fort and the surrounding settlement. During the fighting earlier in the day, several buildings had been set ablaze and smoke drifted through the air, and the heat from the fires only made the atmosphere around the guardhouse even more suffocating. As the evening progressed, British soldiers, company officials, and others captured during the fall of Fort William were gathered in this very room. The exact number of captives has been debated by historians ever since, but according to the account later written by John, a total of 146 prisoners were eventually assembled. Shortly after 8 o'clock that night, the guards began forcing the prisoners toward the small cell, driving them forward with threats of blows from clubs and swords. In their attempts to avoid being struck, the prisoners surged toward the doorway to the cell all at once, and this rush of bodies quickly became chaotic. Men at the back pushed forward, while those near the entrance tried desperately to squeeze inside the narrow room. The pressure eventually grew so intense that once the prisoners began filling the cell, the guards struggled to close the cell door behind them. And by the time it was finally shut, an enormous number of people had been crammed into a space never meant to hold more than a few. You can just imagine stuffing almost 150 people to a slightly larger than average bedroom. At first, though, the prisoners seemed to believe that the situation, while uncomfortable, would only last a short time. Many assumed that they were being held there temporarily while the guards figured out what to do with them, but as the minutes passed and the door remained firmly shut, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The room was so crowded that many of the men could barely move. According to John, the prisoners had been forced into the cell so suddenly that there had been no chance to organize themselves inside. Almost immediately, sweat began pouring from the bodies pressed together in suffocating heat. Many of the prisoners then stripped off their clothing in an attempt to cool themselves and gain even the slightest bit of additional space, but the relief was minimal. The heat alone would have been difficult to endure, but thirst soon became an even greater problem. As perspiration drained moisture from their bodies, the prisoners began craving water. Their breathing also grew labored as the supply of fresh air inside the cell was rapidly consumed. The two small windows offered the only connection to the outside world, and before long, many of the men near the center of the room began struggling toward them in hopes of trying to catch a breath of air. And this movement created immediate mayhem. Those closer to the windows fought to hold their positions, while others pushed forward from behind, each man trying to improve his chances of survival. During this, John became so tightly wedged among the crowd that he was almost unable to move his limbs. The pressure of the bodies around him made it difficult to even shift his position. Desperate for relief of some kind, several prisoners tried appealing to the guards outside. At one point, a large bribe was even offered. A soldier stationed near the window was promised 1,000 rupees if he could arrange for the prisoners to be moved to a larger room. The guard then briefly left his post and attempted to obtain permission from his superiors, but when he returned, he brought the discouraging news that the request had been denied. The prisoners then doubled the offer, and once again, the guard went to see if anything could be done, but the result was the same. Suraj had already gone to sleep for the night, and none of the officers on duty were willing to wake him and ask for instructions, so the prisoners would remain where they were. As the hours dragged on, the conditions inside the cell steadily grew worse. By around 9 o'clock, several men had already collapsed. Some had fainted from exhaustion, while others were beginning to succumb to the intense heat and lack of air. A frantic cry for water spread throughout the room, and eventually one of the guards outside took pity on the prisoners and brought a small amount. The water was then passed through the bars of the window, where John and a few others attempted to collect it in their hats before handing it to men further inside the cell. In their desperation to drink, though, many prisoners lunged forward at once, spilling most of the water before it could reach those near the back, and what little of it was consumed only made their thirst grow. Meanwhile, the struggle near the windows became increasingly violent. Men fought desperately for a space where they could get fresh air, pushing and clawing their way forward. Those who were weaker or already exhausted were easily knocked down, and once on the floor, there was little chance of getting back up in the crushing press of bodies. The guards outside watched the scene through the barred windows, and some even brought lamps closer so they could observe what was happening inside the crowded cell. At one point in the night, a man named Mr. Bailey attempted to impose some sort of order on the situation. Hoping to create some movement of air within the room, he suggested that everyone try sitting down at the same time and then standing up again together on command. The idea was that this coordinated motion might help stir the stagnant air and bring some relief to the prisoners, but the result was disastrous. The men were so tightly packed together that it required tremendous effort to simply move from a standing position to sitting. When the signal was given to stand again, many of the prisoners struggled to regain their footing. Those who couldn't stand quickly enough were knocked down by the movement of the crowd around them, and the result was more confusion and more deaths. And things only grew worse inside the stuffed cell as the night wore on. The heat, the lack of air, and the mounting panic took a heavy toll on the prisoners. By around 11 p.m., men were dying in increasing numbers, and the atmosphere inside the room had become unbearable. The smell of sweat and the presence of so many bodies crowded together filled the air with a suffocating stench. One by one, men continued to collapse as the long night dragged toward the morning, and by the early hours before dawn, the crowded dungeon had grown eerily quiet. The desperate cries and frantic struggles that had filled the room earlier had begun to fade as exhaustion and death claimed more of the prisoners. Shortly after sunrise on June 21st, Siraj awoke and gave orders for the prisoners to be brought before him. When the door was finally opened at around 6 o'clock that morning, the sight was shocking even to those who had watched the events unfold through the windows during the night. The small room was filled with bodies. Men were slumped against one another in every part of the cell. Some lay crumpled on the floor, while others remained standing where they had died, their bodies held upright by the press of those around them. The crowd had been so tightly packed that many didn't even have the space to fall. After the door was opened, the surviving prisoners staggered out into the morning air. Many were barely conscious and gasping for breath after hours trapped in the suffocating heat of that room. The sudden rush of fresh air revived some of them, though they were weak and disoriented from the ordeal they had endured. John later wrote that it took him nearly 20 minutes to make his way out of the crowded room. The bodies had formed such a dense barrier near the doorway that those still living had difficulty forcing their way past them. When the living were finally out of the cell, they numbered just 23 of the original 146 that went in the night before. Once the survivors were accounted for, the guards began the grim work of cleaning the cell. The bodies were then dragged out one at a time and carried away, and according to several accounts, some were thrown into a nearby ditch without ceremony. The handful of survivors were soon brought before Siraj, and John later claimed that the nawab showed little concern when he learned what happened during the night. And whether he had been aware of the prisoner's condition before morning has remained a matter of debate among historians, as would other aspects of the story, but more on that in a moment. John and 3 other survivors were later transferred as prisoners to the nawab's capital, and news of the incident would soon spread far beyond Bengal. Within a matter of months, the story of what happened inside the small dungeon at Fort William would reach Britain itself, where it would provoke outrage and demands for revenge. In the aftermath of the Black Hole of Calcutta tragedy, John would write the most detailed version of what happened, and his narrative would soon circulate widely throughout Britain. At the time, few people openly questioned his version of the events. Several of the other survivors appeared to support his account, and none publicly contradicted the basic outline of what he described. As a result, the story of the Black Hole of Calcutta was widely accepted as fact. As historians began examining the incident more closely in later generations, however, some began to wonder whether John's account might not have been entirely accurate. Specifically, questions were raised around the number of prisoners who might have actually been confined in the cell and about how many truly died there during that night. One analysis conducted in the 1950s attempted to reconstruct the likely number of prisoners involved. Based on available evidence, the study estimated that the total number of people confined in the dungeon may have been closer to 64 rather than the 146 that John claimed. In this reconstruction, roughly 21 prisoners survived the night. Other historians have pointed out that the records of the Fort William garrison indicate that only 43 soldiers were listed as missing after the fall of the fort. If those figures are accurate, the number of victims could not have been as high as John wrote. These discrepancies have led many scholars to conclude that while the tragedy itself almost certainly occurred, the scale of the disaster may have been significantly smaller than the original narrative suggested. Regardless of how the details are viewed today, though, the story of the Black Hole of Calcutta remained a powerful part of Britain's historical memory for generations. Monuments were eventually erected in Calcutta to commemorate those who had died in the incident. The original Fort William, though, was eventually demolished and replaced by a new fort constructed farther to the south. And with the destruction of the old fort, the physical location of the Black Hole of Calcutta seemingly disappeared along with it. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.